Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to another Coach's Corner where we go over why we do what we do with a bunch of different things in the gym. Last week we talked about what is CrossFit. This week I want to talk about nutrition and what is our approach to nutrition. What do we suggest for you, whether you work out in the gym or not? Our approach comes directly from CrossFit. And so what CrossFit has laid out for us is they lay it out as eat meat and vegetables, nuts and seeds, some fruit, little starch, and no sugar. And we're going to keep intake to levels that support exercise but not body fat. So a lot to digest there. Very simple, but what does that look like when we actually put that into application? So the big picture is, in general, we want to make sure we're eating foods that are real foods. So I'm talking about foods that if you wanted to, you could grow yourself or raise yourself. So if you could do one of those two things, it's probably something that we want to eat a lot of. And if it's not that, it's probably something that either we want to avoid or limit how much we eat. So now let's kind of look at this and how would we break this down meal by meal. So what we want to do is we would really like to ideally find somewhere where we would eat similar to what I'm going to lay out here 3 to 5 times a day. Probably for you that's going to look like 2 or 3 larger meals with 1 or 2 snacks in between. So the way this is going to look is here we've got our plate, and we're going to break our plate up into sections that reflects this statement here. So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to draw a line right down the middle. And this whole half of our plate is going to be our vegetables. So our vegetables, ideally we'd like them to be green, but any vegetable that you like is going to be great here. We don't want to overcomplicate it. The answer is it a vegetable? If it's a yes, great, let's eat a bunch of it. The other portion, another portion we have for our plate is we're going to make a quarter here. And this one, we're going to put protein. So protein generally is going to be meat. All meat is protein, but some of our friends that might be vegan, vegetarian, or they have some sort of issue where processed meat doesn't work quite well for them, this would even be some of our plant-based proteins like tofu, for example, could go there. So a quarter of our plate vegetables, a quarter of our plate protein, half of our plate vegetables, and now we're going to look at some of the other portions. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to split this up into an eighth. So far we've got meat and vegetables, now we've got nuts, seeds, some fruit, little starch. And so next one we're going to throw up there is we're going to throw carb in here. So what is carb and why is it not on this list? Carb in its simplest form is sugar, but what we're looking at isn't the table sugar and sweets. What we're looking at is things like starches and fruits are what we're thinking of in this particular block here. So that's going to be things like potatoes, it's going to be rice, it's going to be fruit, some sort of carbohydrate source is what we're going to get here because our vegetables are really great in vitamins and minerals, and our carbs are going to be really great for getting us that fuel that we need. So eighth of a plate is going to be our carb, and then the other eighth of our plate we've got is our fat source here. So this fat source is what we're looking at when we are looking at nuts and seeds. You might hear some things online like, is fat bad? Is fat good? What's good fat? What's good fat? What's bad fat? We're going to break it down here. Super simple. Good fat is going to be things like nuts and seeds. We're looking at things like real butter or things like olive oil, coconut oil. Your fats that aren't as great for you are going to be things like cheap dressings or cheaper condiments or canola oil. So ideally this is going to be a nut seed or like a real butter. And so that's going to be a portion of our plate. And so we can break this plate every time that we eat. We can break it up this way. So every time you eat, We're looking at protein, vegetables, then to your carb, then to your fat, and you're going to be in great shape. And just by doing this 3 to 5 times a day, probably 3 big plates like this a day, and then maybe 1 or 2 small plates like this a day for your snacks, that alone is going to allow you to keep those intakes to levels that support exercise but not body fat. So outside of that, I know there's a lot of like fads out there, like should I do keto, should I do low carb, should I do no fat, should I do carnivore, should I do vegetarian. This is what we recommend for the majority of our people. This works, this is sustainable, this is simple, and it allows you to know how much I should have of each thing on my plate and making sure you're hitting each of those boxes, because we don't have time to overanalyze and think about what works and what doesn't. We just want to know, how do I build my plate, how do I eat it, and how do I move on with my life. So, because the big thing for us is we want our food to be fuel, and we want that to be able to transfer outside the gym into our exercise. That way we feel better about ourselves, we feel better about the food that we eat. So that's our philosophy on nutrition. Make sure you're eating your protein, make sure you're eating your vegetables, make sure you got a carb, a fat, and also make sure you're throwing a glass of water in there. We hope you like this, and we'll see you next week for our next Coach's Corner.